Hi, everyone, and welcome to this controversy at noon on the topic of traditional and self-publishing and the murky, at least to me, area in between those two publication options. I'm Barb Howard. I'm a Calgary writer and the lucky moderator of this amazing panel, which consists of Charlene Carr, Jama Fixon, Naomi K. Lewis, and I can't guarantee that we'll have controversy. Writers are so nice, but I can guarantee that we'll have good content. We're going to answer specific questions that were submitted by listeners after a previous controversy at noon on this same topic. The WGA land acknowledgement was on the screen before we started here today. So just to add to that, and in the spirit of reconciliation, I like to recommend books from Indigenous authors that I've read. And today I'd like to recommend a book called Powwow, A Celebration Through Song and Dance by Karen Pheasant Niganagwe. Karen is a assistant professor at Mount Royal University, and she is a jingle dress dancer who is in the Canadian Dance Hall of Fame. Powwow is traditionally published through Orca. Orca is a children's publisher, but this is a great primer for all ages. The other book I'd like to recommend is also a good primer. It's 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph, and it is published by Page Two Books, Inc., which is a hybrid publisher. And we'll get to that term in a few minutes. I'd also recommend all the books written by today's panelists. We have great writers here, and we need to meet them before we get rolling. So, Charlene, can we start with you? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm Charlene Carr. I'm the author of 11 novels. The most recent two, Hold My Girl and We Rip the World Apart, were traditionally published by HarperCollins in Canada. And then I have 9 others that I self-published. So I've been on both sides of the spectrum. And I'm writing and speaking from Nova Scotia.
That's great. And thanks, Jama.
Hi, I'm Jama. I have, I think, 8 books. I have 3 published by Sourcebooks Landmark, traditionally published under the pen name Audrey Blake, which I co-write with my friend Regina. And I have a solo crime thriller called The Specimen, also from Sourcebooks, traditionally published, came out this fall. Before finding publishing with Sourcebooks, I did self-publish for comic regencies. So again, like Charlene, I've done both, been on both sides of this divide.
Great, super interesting. And Naomi.
So I'm Naomi. I've written 9 books, but some of them are my own and some are books that I've ghostwritten. So my own books and my name are all traditionally published as a novel, a short story collection, and a memoir, and an anthology that I co-edited. And then there's 5 books that I have ghostwritten. 3 of them are traditionally published, and 2 of them were published by hybrid presses. So I worked closely with those authors and editors. So I've basically worked on both sides of this as well. And I also work in publishing. So I'm an editor at Freehand Press, and I've worked in magazine publishing and editing as well.
Super. So we got this great panel going here. And also I felt there was about 5 more topics for controversies at noon that came up. Ghostwriting, co-writing, collaborating, for another day. Before we get rolling, there's some terms that I am confused on, so I'm going to assume that some of the listeners are confused about. And then since we're going to be using them throughout the questions that people asked, wanted to get on common ground there. I don't know how to go about it, but Jama, I thought I'd hit you up to say, but the main group is traditional publishing, self-publishing, and hybrid publishing. What can you tell us what you think the what would be your definitions, or how do you understand those three terms?
I take kind of a legalistic approach to it, maybe, and it's about, who owns the rights. So my self-published works, again, I own the rights, so I own that intellectual property and then package it and market it to readers without any licensing. Whereas my traditionally published work, I sell the rights and then I work with my publisher to sell that packaged intellectual property, and then receive a royalty. So to me, it's about the rights. And I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. So like my self-published novels, I didn't have the expertise or knowledge or interest in producing the audiobooks of those. So I retained the ebook and print rights, but then sold the audio rights. So, writers and creators have a lot of different options about how they want to sell their intellectual property, whether that's by selling the rights, selling the actual packaged product for reader consumption. And I tend to define it by who owns the rights, or are you selling the product, or are you selling the intellectual property?
And well, maybe that's actually a way of understanding it that I haven't heard of, which makes sense, as long as I guess you're keeping your own copyright and not releasing that particular, right? But I've also heard it as a flow of money. So well, maybe I'll jump to Charlene. Like, does that, what Jane was saying, does that work for you? And also, how do you see hybrid as fitting in there? Or do you guys even talk about the hybrid books? It's the trickiest one for me.
Yeah, so what James said makes sense to me. For more of a, I guess, layman's way of looking at it or term, the big difference for me is having, like, everything that James said is correct. But personally, I find the big difference is having a team or not having a team, or creating a team. As you're self-publishing, you're either doing everything on your own, or you're hiring the cover designer, the formatter, the marketers, the advertisers. Whereas when you traditionally publish, as Jamie mentioned, you get either an advance or royalties or both. And well, you definitely would have royalties. The advance is sometimes debatable. And then there's already a team in place who does the majority of those things for you. Sometimes marketing is a little more on the authors than authors would like. Yeah, and so that's kind of the big difference for me. As far as hybrid goes, I've never done it. As far as I know, it's often a situation where there is a publishing house or imprint, but rather than generally, I think you retain your rights and you pay to have it published, as opposed to being paid to have it published.
I've worked with hybrid presses a couple of times, if you want me to speak to that.
Yeah. Well, I was going to next to you anyhow.
Yeah, so two of my ghostwriting clients published with hybrid, two different hybrid presses. And so that really, meant that I was working with them as well. And the way that works is, as the author, you pay the press, as you just said, but you also pay not just for publication, but for editing, for design, for distribution. You get kind of like a menu of services, and each one has a price attached to it. And so they have in-house, most of the people who work at these hybrid presses have come from traditional publishing. Often left traditional publishing to start their own hybrid press, and then the editors are the same quality of editing that you would get in proofreading and design and all of that you would get at a traditional press. And so, as I understand it, the menu that you choose from, some of these services are optional and some aren't. So they're not going to let you publish a book with them that's not edited, that's not proofread, that's not professionally designed. And there is a vetting process. So they don't, there's an acquisitions process, so they won't just publish anything. but they will, you know, it's easier to get published by them than it is by a traditional press, but they still have kind of like quality control or, you know, that kind of vetting in place. So it has to be well written. It has to have some kind of, I mean, it has to have the qualities that a book needs to have to, you know, and it has to, yeah, be properly edited. So it's kind of like the press, those presses are trying to find this place for themselves, I think, where they would have the same status in many ways as a traditional publisher, and that their books would be of the same quality in every way.
And
And when
which way do the royalties flow? Like who gets them?
well, the author owns the rights 100%. And so it's really like sometimes it's print on demand. Sometimes it's you know, one of my ghost writing clients, his book. And then he's kind of like he was the first person I worked with as a ghostwriter. His name is Spencer Beach, and his book came out in 2010, and he's still selling tons of copies. Like it's a Canadian bestseller still. And the reason for that is that he's a professional speaker, and he sells books at his talks. So he'll, you know, give talks to corporations, and mostly like his books about workplace safety. So it's usually like huge audiences of people who work in, you know, potentially dangerous professions like in oil and gas and stuff like that. And then he will, as well as being paid a fee for his speaking, like the company will buy enough books for everyone in the audience. And sometimes that's, you know, thousands of people in one day. So
We wish for that, all of us.
yeah, and so I mean, it made so much sense for him to pay for his book to be published at that, you know, professional quality level, and then for him to own it outright. He didn't have to wait like a year or 2 years or 3 years for it to come out. He doesn't have to wait for the publisher to decide to do a reprint. Like when he needs more, he just gets them printed again. It's all completely up to him going forward. So that is like the perfect situation for somebody like that.
And that is kind of what that 21 things you may not know about the Indian Act. That's that scenario as well. I think it grew out of an article from a speaker who runs a company as well. And
Yeah.
comes across an audience frequently that would buy the book as part of the package.
Yeah, exactly. And I think most people who do that, because I've also worked as an editor for companies like that, and it seems like to me that a lot of the people who choose to publish that way do have like a built-in platform and audience, and they know they're going to sell books, and they don't need a publisher to do that marketing and distribution for them. And what like their priority is to have the book as quickly as possible and as frequently as they need it, and to not have to pay a middleman in a way, you know, like they pay once and then that's it.
Yeah, that's good. That's good information. Thanks, Naomi. I got one more word here, indie, which I see being used as people who are self-publishing, sort of in the sense of music more, but then I'm also seeing it used as to refer to smaller presses, or even just any press that's not the big five. So I don't know, Jema, do you use the word indie, or have you used it for any of your books? And
I think
what,
sometimes,
and in what sense? In what sense? Yeah.
I think sometimes there's a stigma with self-publishing where because of the connection to like indie music, you know, like I think it's a good descriptor of self-publishing that maybe doesn't carry some of that stigma with it, which I think is really tough, right? Because there are a lot of fantastic books by talented writers that elect to go that route, but I think
I agree.
they know just won't ever purchase a self-published book.
Yeah, I agree. It makes it sound, more like what it is. It could be a good
more what it is, right?
Yeah. And so, Charlene, is that your understanding of indie as well? Nothing to do with the small press. Like I don't know why I see it first.
I mean, it's used for both, but yes, after the first year or two, I certainly refer to myself as an indie published author rather than a self-published author. And I think for a lot of us, it is the idea that, especially if you're viewing this as, if you're viewing it professionally and you're approaching it as running an independent publishing company, whether you're just publishing yourself or other authors as well, then there's going to be some sort of a team, whether, it's your designers or your editors or your formatters. It's not just something generally that you're doing on your own or that's just for you. The word indie encompasses the idea that this is an independent, publishing endeavor rather, more of a business, I guess. But at the same time, it makes sense for that to be used for small presses as well. And sometimes that's how small presses start. They're publishing either themselves or their friends, and then they get a reputation and they start taking on other people. So it can go in that direction, but it does make it a little bit confusing.
It's
Whether
although embedded in there is a a tip for people going to self-publish too, to how to frame it for yourself and for readers. It's
Mhm.
interesting. So I'm going to move on to the start of the questions. Unless Naomi, you felt you wanted to jump in on the indie word. Okay, because I'm going to give you the next question anyhow.
Okay.
All right, here it is. What does the panel think is the best publishing vehicle for a book about the history of a sports franchise in Alberta? And then the background to that a little bit is the person who submitted the question is looking at publishing a sports team history book and is wondering what would be best what's the best route for publishing?
Oh my gosh, I wish I knew I had a definitive answer for that person. Yeah, I mean, if either of you want to jump in with, if you feel like you have a definitive answer, please go ahead. But I feel like, usually when writers ask me like, what's the best route for me, like with a book like that, I feel like it would be worth trying if they wanted a traditional publisher to go that route, right? Like see if they could get an agent. I mean, it depends on so many things, like what's the sports franchise? Is this a book that a lot of people are going to want to buy? How well written is the book? How accessible is the book? But a book like that, I could see it being picked up by like even a bigger press, one of the big presses, or like a local independent press. But then if the person is either confident that they're going to sell a lot of books or doesn't really need the money, like if some people who write books, like it's a passion project. I've worked with people who just could afford to self-publish a book or hire an independent press, work with or a hybrid press, I mean, and it wasn't a huge issue for them if they broke even or made a profit. So if they're in that situation, then it's certainly faster and more, faster and easier in a way to self-publish or try to work with a hybrid press. So, I mean, there's a lot of different questions that I think I would need to ask that person to really figure out what would be the best option for them. Like, do they have a big platform already? Do they know that they can sell this? Like, is this something that they could market themselves to fans of this sports franchise and with confidence that it would be picked up? Like, what kind of book is it? Is it like a history, or is it, a coffee table book? Those are really different kinds of endeavors with different expenses attached to them, and different publishing models may be better for one or the other. So like, I guess it's hard to answer that without having a fuller picture of all.
So that's a need more information, but then you gave us a bunch of the considerations and including motivation for publishing it in the first place, who's going to read it. Charlene, do you want to add anything to that, or?
Sure. I think all those considerations are really great to consider. And also the consideration of what you want out of this book. And Naomi touched on that a little bit, but do you want it to just exist? Do you want it to actually, have a large reach and reach a lot of people? Do you want to continue to write other books on top of this? And so, if you want beyond it just existing and being in the world, Then the question needs to come in when you're thinking about self-publishing or traditional publishing is how much do you want to put into it? Because if you wanted to have that reach, if you know, are hoping to write other books, if you want it in bookstores and you're choosing to self-publish, then you have to approach this book as like, this is at least a part-time, if not a full-time career for you, if you want a chance at actually seeing it be a success financially and as far as sales numbers go. Because the market is so crowded that in order for a self-published book, be it, you know, fiction, nonfiction, to actually sell, you really, you know, you've got to be working on marketing. You've got to be contacting individual bookstores if you want print sales. And for something like that, I think it would be more of a print sale book than a digital one. If you are going the digital route or print, you've got to be doing, you know, Amazon ads potentially and Facebook ads and like really marketing and you know, looking at sales and boosts and all of that. And it can be very intensive if you want to actually have any kind of splash. So if that's not appealing to you, then I would definitely recommend trying for a traditional publisher first who would have those avenues that mean you don't have to make, you know, your career or your side hustle this book.
Yeah, that's good. Where I'm actually going to come back to you on marketing. So next question, but Jamie,
Can I just add?
Oh,
Sorry,
yeah.
I just want to add, like all of those aspects that you're talking about. If you self-publish, you have to do it yourself. If you have a traditional publisher, they're going to take more of that on. With a hybrid publisher, like they can also take on those aspects of it to some extent, but you have to pay for each part of it, right? And it's not cheap. So again, it comes back to like, how much money do you have to spend on this? What's your budget and what are your expectations of making that money, like realistic expectations of making that money back through sales, and like how much do you care if you make that money back through sales?
Yeah, no, that's good. Jama, do you have more to add on this one?
Yes, I agree. I agree 100%.
I don't know. I didn't hear anyone mention time, but I mean, you know, I'm the oldest here, so it's kind of like, really, how long do I have to find a publisher for this book?
Yeah, there's that too. It takes so long to find a traditional publisher, and you don't know. I like I said, I'd written 9 books. Actually, I've written 11, but 2 are, you know, out in the ether, and one of them has been for over a year. And who knows, you know, when it is or isn't ever going to land with a publisher. So like to be in that situation, like how long can you actually tolerate that? And you know, I think a lot of people self-publish because they kind of can't take it anymore. The waiting, the endless waiting, right?
Well, and like this is a sports team history book, like how much more history do you want to pass before anybody gets to read what events could occur? So I mean, maybe we can touch on it another way too in a later question, but it begs the question is, are there certain kinds of books that lend themselves to self-publication? Or we talked about how some, you know, there is sort of a style of at least author or material that maybe suits hybrid the best, but it's all open to anybody. Next question is marketing one. So Charlene, since you were talking about it, I'll ask you first. The big advantage of traditional publishing over self-publishing is generally seen to be the marketing aspects. From getting placement in stores to advertising in trade publications to arranging author events, there are a whole host of marketing activities that are not available to the self-published author. What can a self-published author do to overcome this advantage?
So, I mean, maybe I'm not the best person to talk about this because I didn't do the things for the most part.
Right.
The huge difference that I've seen being a traditionally published author is all those things that you've talked about. My books are in bookstores. You know, they're sometimes getting front of store placement. They are in newsletters for Indigo, and I'm getting invites to author events. I'm getting invites to festivals, and all of that could have been possible as a self-published author, but you know, it's not like you contact Indigo and say, can you carry my books? You contact each individual store of Indigo if you want your books to be in there to see if they will carry your books. And the same would go for all the independent bookstores. And so just the reach that you would have, like, I can't even imagine how difficult it would be to try to get your book in stores across the country, self-published. You know, I think maybe early on I asked like my local chapters, and they were a little wishy-washy, and I never ended up following up. A few emails. I think I talked to someone in person and they were like, "Oh, we'll think about it, get back to you." And of course no one got back to me, and I was just like, is this worth my time and effort for the few books that might sell on the shelf? I just said, no,
or
it's
sitting at
not
a
worth it.
table in there for the day or so.
Yeah, and I did that type of thing at craft fairs, and sometimes you'd be there for 4 hours and you sell one book, and sometimes you'd sell none. And obviously that can happen, at an event with a traditionally published author, but it, yeah, it's just that aspect of self-publishing, unless you have a lot of connections and unless you're really willing and ready to like take your feet into stores and be on the phone and be on emails and show that there's a reason they should carry your book, and be willing to take the cost of the returns, because if they're carrying your book and they don't sell, you have to pay for that printed copy. I mean, I don't even know if it's worth it. I think for the most part, self-publishers who have any kind of success, it's through ebooks. Print is more just kind of a vanity thing, and like their biggest fans may buy the print books. And from what I understand, and the self-publishers authors I know, and to that point, you were talking about, what books are really successful, and they're often books like thriller, fantasy, romance, the type of books that have readers who are just voracious and may read a book every day or two. And, they're buying them for 99 cents to $2.99 for an ebook and just racing through them. And like those are the books that I see being very successful. And so if you're not that type of author, and if you're wanting to see your books in print, then it would take, I think, a lot to be successful as a self-published author. Having a platform could be what it takes. If you have some platform, whether it be for fiction or for nonfiction, as Naomi was talking about, then that's an area where, it could be easier to be much more successful.
Like it really helps if you're, famous. Yeah. Cory Doctorow deciding to self-publish his short story collection or something like that. I feel like that's an easier road than most have. Jema, to add, do you have marketing? Is that your experience, or did you market your first books?
Yeah. So, and like Charlene said, selling ebooks was successful. Like you can access digital platforms really easily as an indie author or a self-published author. And if you are writing good copy and blurbs, and managing your online ads and finding the right keywords, which is definitely something that you can learn how to do, you can do all right. And I felt like the self-published books that I had were successful for me when I was writing for a defined genre in a series. When I wanted to do something different, it was harder. Not to say that it could be done. Like there's people that do it, but the self-published writers that I know that are most successful at it are writing in those genres that Charlene mentioned: romance, thrillers, fantasy, often series writing, and they write so much and they write so fast.
Mm-hmm.
They release several books a year. And I did publish 2 books this year, but I kind of almost lost my mind doing it. And like I can do a book a year, or maybe slightly faster than that, because I do co-write my other ones, but it's intense, and I cannot do 4 titles a year, which is the self-published authors I know who are really hitting it out of the park. That's what they're doing.
Well, so it's a bit of a quantity thing as well.
Yeah.
Quantity and quality. Yeah. Yeah. Naomi.
Those readers that read a lot, like those readers that do read a book a day, or that, just go from one book to the next. And so when you have your backlist or your series, it's a little bit self-perpetuating.
Yeah, like the follow-up to that question was a question from someone else saying, do self-published ebooks typically outsell print versions? And you guys have answered that, yes. And then Naomi, I don't know if is that true? That's not true for traditionally published, or is it?
Gosh, I don't know. I don't know that
Great
much
question.
because I work as an editor. And the sales, I don't have all the information at my fingertips. I think we sell more print books than ebooks, but I could be wrong. I think that but that's a literary press, right? And we sell a lot of books in stores, at events. A lot of, I would guess, our sales are are largely from those kinds of things. But and we don't have audiobooks, which is a whole other topic that we could talk about. Just like a lot of independent presses, it's too expensive. It's just not. And I think that's true for most independent presses. But yeah, I don't have the answer to that question.
Charlene had her at a, maybe you have the answer.
I don't have the answer. I have anecdotal from my experience.
That works for me.
So my books are published in English in 3 territories. So I have a US publisher, a Canadian publisher. Actually, my US is Sourcebooks Landmark. And then a UK publisher. And so I can see from my statements that in both Canada and the US, where my ebooks, like the ebooks are generally priced somewhere in Canada, probably $13 to $15 range, and in the US, maybe $10 to $14 range. And they would be less than 10% of the sales. It's almost exclusively print books. And I think that is because the majority of ebook readers, and maybe partly because of self-published authors, are used to paying $5 or less for their ebooks. Now, in the UK, my ebook sales are a bit better. They're probably 30-ish, maybe 40% of the sales. But over there, my particular publisher, at least, is selling them for like $2.99 to $4.99 pounds. So it's a much lower price point that's more accessible, obviously, for ebook readers who, and in defense of that, I'm kind of similar. I don't want to pay $15 for an ebook a lot of the time when, I could have a print book for a few dollars more and either, just hold it in my hands or share it around with my friends and family. And so yeah, in my experience, print is definitely the higher seller. And I don't know for sure, but I think that's because of the price points.
Good info. Thank you. Our
I'm
next.
curious, Jema. Sorry if you found
Oh,
that too.
I was going to hit Jema with the next question, but yes, did you want to jump in?
Well, you talked about moving from indie to traditional, and being in stores and print sales becoming such a bigger part of your income. I've found that too. Also, I found that having a different agent for my audio rights after switching to traditional publishing, my audio rights, and those have increased for me as well. And another thing to pay attention to consider in this whole indie hybrid traditional is foreign language rights. So I have books either translated or forthcoming in 9 languages now. And so, that's a sizable amount of income, and harder to sell foreign language rights as an indie author unless you're willing to front translation costs, audio book production costs. And for me, audio especially is a big market. So you can do those either way. It's just, how curious and ambitious are you in exploring different sources of income for your creative work?
Yeah, and how How keen are you in making your book work in various ways?
But one
I mean,
thing
how many legs can you give your book?
is, as an indie writer, you have to do all this marketing, you have to do all this editing. And I think there's definitely less of that as a traditionally published writer, but there's still some of it. So I'm still doing a lot of my own event planning, reaching out to contacts, visiting indie bookstores whenever I'm in an area and being like, hey, have you considered stocking my book? So that's not going to go away. And you have to be willing, I think, to embrace that as part of your writerly identity. And I'm still hiring out things. So, this year having 2 books coming out, I needed to hire a developmental art of my own just so I could meet my publication deadlines. I still hire my own sensitivity readers. So, you're not going to avoid all your upfront costs either. Like, you're not going to offload that all onto a publisher either.
I'm going to steer right into the next question because you kind of just answered it anyhow, maybe, but it was for indie publishing. I don't know if that would apply to what you're working on right now, but and again, indie, I'm not sure which meaning it's intended here, but do you employ professional writers from the writing community for your editing / publishing services that for, I guess, for your writing, and before you would send it to either your traditional publisher, or if you would self-publish it yourself, or to a hybrid one. I'll ask you, Jamie, because you already said you would. You just said that you hired services because of a time crunch. Would you usually do that? I mean, I think it's a great idea. I'm going to steal that idea. So,
I think a number of writers I know use developmental editors, whether they're indie or traditional publisher. And especially if you're trying to keep up with industry timelines, like Charlene, you can probably speak to this as well. Like, it can be tough. And the more books you want to get your book on time so that it can be published according to your publishing schedule. And I think kind of before you're published, you kind of can sometimes have the luxury of having a writers group or a critique group and get feedback on your projects that way. But I feel like when you get paid, or when you're getting paid for your work, there's a limit to how much you can impose on your friends and your acquaintances to, read your work and give feedback. And then you also get what you pay for. So, I'm not going to expect the same necessarily excellent feedback on developmental feedback from someone who's doing this for me out of friendship as compared to someone who's paying me. And with a developmentor, I could say, I know I only have 2 weeks for you to read this and get back to me, but I'm paying you, so please get this back to me in 2 weeks.
yeah, and with your peers as help doing it for free too, then you're in a debit position and have to, which is good, you get to read other things. But sometimes if you don't have time, you don't have time to read other people's work as well. Charlene,
so much of that is reciprocal.
Charlene, you hire?
No, I haven't hired anyone since I've been with the traditional publishers. I will probably hire, I don't know if I call it a sensitivity reader, but more of a, I guess, authenticity reader perhaps for my next book. Just because the subject matter is something that I have little life experience of, and I just want to, it's a sports, surfing actually, and I want to make sure that I'm getting it right. And so I wouldn't expect my publishers to pay for that. I have been paid by traditional publishers to be kind of a sensitivity or beta reader, so I know at times they do it when they think it's necessary. And there were discussions on my last book about whether we needed a sensitivity reader or not, and we decided we didn't, because a lot of it did relate to my own life experience. But I think for a developmental editor, I've wanted to, but I don't imagine that I would unless I was not under contract. And that's because of discussions I've had with my agent, even about getting the book beta read. And she said that she wouldn't want me to change it based on somebody else's feedback when my editor might have different opinions. And so I think if I were in a position where I was no longer under contract, then that might be where I'd go back to either hiring a developmental editor or going through rounds of beta readers. But as Jama said too, when you're under contract, you have a timeline. And so beta readers, you can't exactly be like, give this back to me in 3 weeks. Whether they're friends or, readers that you've
Say
acquired
take all
over
the
the
time you
years.
want and then every day wonder where it is.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I think for the developmental editor thing, it does make a lot of sense of, imagine paying and getting, restructuring your novel, for example, based on the feedback of a developmental editor and then having your actual editor switch it around. If you're already under contract with them, that's something that I would be concerned about. But I'm sure there are people, I do actually know there are people who do it even when they're under contract. And I guess you just have to really trust that that developmental editor would send you in a direction that your own editor would hopefully like.
Yeah, that's a good point. Naomi, from all the various books, I mean, you've been hired to ghostwrite, so then you probably don't go hire another editor. Maybe you do. I don't know. Maybe tell us about what Freehand expects, or something like that. Yeah.
Well, so with ghostwriting, no, we don't hire. Like, none of my ghostwritees have hired like a second or an editor, except they kind of have, because like through the hybrid press or the traditional press, like they're assigned an editor, right? So they're not finding an editor and paying them, but they do have an editor who's not me, who's basically editing me and them together. So it's kind of like a 3-way process at that point, which is an interesting kind of an interesting process. And then so at Freehand, we're an independent, small-ish press, and our editors are in-house, me being one of them. Occasionally we contract out to a freelance editor, but our authors don't, as far as I know, hire development, but maybe they do. I mean, I have no way of knowing if a book that's submitted, actually, sorry, let me backtrack, because I do know that some of the books that we end up accepting have already been edited by someone that the author hired, had a developmental editor, and then they also have an in-house editor at Freehand. And then I've also been hired as a developmental editor, like many times, by someone who either doesn't have a publisher yet or does, but sometimes, and that just made me think of this, what you were saying, Charlene, like sometimes independent traditional publishers are so small that like I had this experience recently where they don't really have, sometimes it's like a 1-person operation and they don't do a lot of editing, and their authors basically have to have a developmentally perfect manuscript to submit. And so, I had an author recently hire me as his editor, already knowing who his publisher was going to be, like, I don't think officially under contract, but, verbally agreed kind of thing. And he needed to pay me to edit his book before submitting it, because like there wasn't really going to be a substantial editing process. It was more going to be like copy editing and proofreading, and that's it at the press. So, and I mean, when you think about it, it's kind of like an interesting situation where it's not a hybrid press, it's traditional press, but the author is still paying for at least one of the services that like we think of as being part of the traditional publishing experience. Just because like publishers have like less and less resources, right? Fewer and fewer ways of I mean, a lot, like in Canada, presses, except for the big corporate ones, are publicly funded, and often like that's all our funding. We don't really make much money from sales, and so there's really limited resources. And I mean, that's part of the reason that the whole publishing landscape has been changing, right? And why it's getting harder and harder for writers to get published by traditional publishers, and then to have a publishing experience that's like A, lucrative, and B, like satisfying in all ways for them to even feel that it's worth it to go that route, and that it's preferable to, like, why, you know, for a lot of people, it's not preferable anymore to self-publishing.
Yeah.
That's such a good point. You know, and something that I wasn't thinking of, it depends so much what publisher you're with. Like I happen to be with one of the big five, and so,
Yeah,
you know, I'm sure my agent's advice is with that in mind. You know,
yes,
not
of
only do I
course.
have my editor, like on Hold My Girl, they had a second editor at the house. No, on We Rip the World Apart, because they wanted to make sure it was really solid and they just wanted another person's opinion. So, you know, it had two editors working on it.
Yeah,
And so it's
yeah,
a really different experience than a small house that wouldn't be able to do that.
absolutely.
Because other than say the big five push, I mean, people are always like, who's making the money in publishing and who's taking it on? Like nobody, unless you know, except for a few publishers and a few authors that just like, you know, it's the same size pie that with more and more authors, I guess, is part of the problem, or maybe and also part of the good part, we get to read more things.
But it's not the same size pie either. Like it's a smaller pie and it's a differently shaped pie. Like everything is changing in so many different ways.
Yeah. Or lots of little pies. I don't know. Tarts.
What kind of pie is it? Is it even a pie? I don't know.
They got one question left, and it's huge. We could talk for another hour on it, but it's of interest to get going on it anyhow. The question is, what is the process for setting up one's own publishing house for self-publishing, viability, costs, and legalities? And in this question, I'm not sure whether the person who sent it in is wondering, like, if you like the truest of self-publishing where you actually print your book and all, if they're talking about that, or if they're talking about just writing an indie book, their first indie book. So anybody want to jump in and take a stab at that? I have not been timing who's been talking or anything. I don't have anyone. I don't know. Jama, do you want to
Sure, I'll give it a go.
get us rolling on that? Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, like I can't speak to the legalities at all. Not my wheelhouse. Is it possible? Yeah, it's totally possible. I mean, that's kind of what is so exciting about the publishing and creative writing industry right now, is that so much is possible. You don't have to actually own a press with all this type and buy a whole bunch of paper. Like you can do it. You know, you can hire your own developmental editor. You can hire a cover designer. You can hire marketing. You can hire copy editing. You can do all these things. That said, there is a ton of risk involved. And, you know, like maybe I don't want to come off as breezy and like, you know, I had this deadline. I had to hire a copy editor. Well, it was someone whose work I knew well, someone whose work I knew well. And, you know, I, you know, applied for Alberta Foundation for the Arts grants to like cover that. Because, you know, an advance, like we all would love to get a huge advance, but, you know, like reality is reality. So like all writers, I think, whether you're indie or traditional or hybrid, have to consider like how much are you willing to invest and how much are you willing to lose. So I mean, the power, I think, of self-publishing is that you can do it on a shoestring.
Mm-hmm.
So you can really mitigate your risk by keeping it low, but there's a lot of maybe unscrupulous people out there. Like I'm sure you have all heard this story of someone who's written something and, oh, but I need to pay for developmental editing before I query it, or I need to buy this publishing package for it to be successful. And you can lose a lot of money out there. So you got to be really careful with how any money that you're investing, any time that you're investing is precious.
In the Writers Guild on their website, I think in the archives, there's an article by Gina and Kerwin about uh, ways to identify scammers in the
Mhm.
self-publishing world. It's a really good article.
And really important.
Yeah, Charlene, any additional tips on if you were setting up your own publishing house now with what you know?
So the article, it implied for self-publishing, not like an independent publishing company that would be doing others' books. Is that
It
correct?
could be either. The question was, what is the process for setting up one's own publishing house? Oh, for self-publishing, it did say,
Okay.
but it
Well,
didn't
I mean,
say, yeah.
initially you don't need to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in Canada, at least, I believe until you're making, it could have changed because it's been a while since I was at, you know, working as a, I guess strictly as an entrepreneur, but you know, it was around 30,000 before you needed to be worrying about, you know, HST and having an official business. You certainly can register a business and, you know, have all of those legalities in place as your publishing imprint, or you can just come up with the publishing imprint name and wait until you get to that point to actually register your business, which is a hefty cost. Like I ended up doing it when I got an agent and got my deals because a tax accountant or some tax person, I can't remember who it was, advised that I would want to make sure that the self-publishing income and the income from the traditional publishers kind of were under the same roof. And so, you know, the imprint that I was publishing my self-publishing books, I made that my company name. And when I incorporated, you know, I rolled that all together, and it's very pricey to do. You need to deal with lawyers and accountants, and just setup is probably going to be somewhere around $5,000. And so I don't think it makes sense to do that unless you're at an income level where it's necessary from a tax perspective. And yeah, otherwise you can just kind of publish. And as far as legalities, I mean, you want to make sure that you have the rights to any cover images you're using, whether you're hiring someone or designing them yourself. That's very important. And that the, you know, the images don't have a limit on them, because sometimes it's like 500 copies. And if your book does really well, that's a problem. But I mean, other than that, I can't really think of any legalities that are very necessary when you're just starting out. I mean, obviously, no plagiarism, right? Like, no kind of libel, or depending on what kind of book you're writing, make sure that content's not in there unless you're going to hire a lawyer, which some publishing companies have, to make sure that everything is as it should be. But, you know, especially if you're just writing fiction, I just can't imagine there's much that you need to worry about when you're starting out. And maybe that would only come if you're actually making enough income that this needs to be an official business for tax reasons. And otherwise, you just declare your income as a, I think it's called self-proprietor.
Yeah,
Sole
I
proprietor.
think to add to that, I have yeah, like, I mean, I won't get into like my whole like how I run my business, but like if you're a sole proprietor and you're making over $30,000, like you do need to pay GST on whatever you earn. So you need to start charging GST. You do need to register. I mean, in Alberta, GST is the only tax. So I don't like, I guess PST, HST, or whatever it is. In other provinces as well, but like anyway, you just need to have like a GST number, and that's not like that's not a big deal. Like to incorporate, it's a bigger deal, right? But to just get that GST number registered, so that you're charging GST, and that means that you're not paying it yourself on everything that you sell. That's, I mean, that seems, if you're going to be making more than $30,000, that is important to do. That's all.
I guess the legality would be, and on also a topic for another controversy at noon is, no, you're saying things, you know, not to do like plagiarism stuff, probably no AI. And that'll come up in.
And also like don't skip things like having an editor, having a proofreader. Like I think sometimes, like I was just reading about Taylor Swift's self-published book.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted Taylor Swift in here.
Well, just that people are complaining that it's full of typos, which seems like really surprising. But you know, I don't know how that happened. She's Taylor Swift. You would think that they could have many proofreaders, but I guess they didn't. But yeah, like if you think that you can just be really careful and not need a proofreader, you're definitely wrong.
In the book, actually, I thought it was a lot of photos, but I did, I'm so glad you mentioned her because I am interested in, it applies to this question. She did start her own publishing house. And not only that, she deciding where it would sell. It's-
Well, most of us don't have the resources.
But people don't have that, but it suggests this, it's the epitome of self-publishing control. Her doing that, and it has, could be discussed all day, but also has lots of admirable qualities about it.
But it's also the epitome of,
Having
someone who
money.
knows that their sales are gonna outweigh like any costs up front, like by a gazillion in her case, right? And so in that case, there's really no reason to have anyone in the middle, like to have that middleman publisher. There's really no reason for it at all. Like if you can afford to, if you know that whatever you pay for all of the services that you need to get a book produced, you're going to make that back in 2 seconds when you start selling it. Why would you not do that?
Yeah, no. That was our last, well, Taylor Swift wasn't a question, but we've had our last official questions. Anybody feel like, oh, I wish I'd done this or said this during here before we conclude?
I don't want to be negative about the idea of self-publishing, but I kind of mentioned it earlier, but really stress that if you're hoping to make money at it, you really, unless like the stars align or you've got a big following, as Naomi was saying, you've got that system in place where you're going to make money right away. Like it takes a lot. And a lot of writers are creatives. A lot of them, I guess you're writer, yeah, you're a creative in some form. I mean, nonfiction could be different, but unless, looking at ads and keywords and all the metadata and marketing and, lots of emails and phone calls to set things up for events. And unless that's something that excites you, just be aware that it can be very draining and it can feel like it takes over your life to the point that you may not have the energy you want to have for the actual creative process of writing. Now, if that excites you, if looking at data and numbers and charts and, or you don't mind if it sells a lot, it's more just to get it out there and know that it exists, great. But just be very aware that actually treating it like a business means you're treating it like a business. And in today's marketplace, if you're not, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to be financially successful with it. And again, it's possible. There are lots of authors who are making very lucrative livings self-publishing. But it's trickier than I think a lot of people think it is to actually make an income from it.
But that's true with ratings, traditionally published books too. So
it is, however, you're not doing all the formatting and the advertising.
You don't even have to know what metadata is.
Exactly. And that's the difference.
Yeah.
100% agree. Charlene.
Yeah. If you want to do it, it also is at your strength. I mean, for me, it's like, I have never had input on a cover or wanted input on a cover. I know that I couldn't create a good book cover. Somebody help me. Yeah, I'm good with words and that's it. Jema, did you want anything else to add?
No.
Hey.
Just second everything that you said.
And, I guess to add to that with the cover, like buying a cover for your book is one thing. Having someone format your book is another. But when it comes to the ads, as far as I understand, like this was probably 6 or 7 years ago that I was really looking into it. But the data that, I was getting told was unless you have kind of at least 14 to 15 books, and now it's probably like 20 to 25, hiring someone to do all the ad stuff for you is almost going to be impossible for you to make money because you've got to pay them and then you've got to make the money back. So it's something that you either have to have a lot of books and those books have to be doing well, or you got to figure it out yourself and you put in the time to not have the cost. And I think that's kind of one of the trickiest things, unless you the ones who seem to be doing the best at self-publishing are the ones who like got in, 2014, 2015 and developed these insanely loyal fans and have, 20 to 40 books in their backlist that can kind of just keep things going. And again, not to say it's not possible, because it totally is. And there are people who are, starting out today and being very successful. They're often one of those genres that we listed, or they're people who are just great with numbers and, maybe get excited and revved up about, looking at all those charts in advertising to see how many clicks each, image or keyword or, the copy is changing. And it's a lot of fine tuning, and it can be draining for the average writer.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that one, my personal takeaway was, apart just from reading before this and from listening to like all the experience here for the panel, is a little bit like, goes back to the first question of this sports team book. Like, you don't have to choose one, or you don't have to think you're a one-way author. I only do traditional, or I only do stuff. Like you might have a project coming up that would fit one of the other models that you haven't used before, or that you haven't used in a while, things like that. And for me, that's like a newish trend in publishing.
Mhm.
So nothing else to add. Love meeting two of you and seeing you again, Naomi. Thanks so much, Charlene, Jama,
Thank you.
Naomi. And whoever's listening, please check out their books, their websites, their socials. Thanks to Ashley Mann and the Writers Guild for hosting and organizing. And thanks to anyone